John Anderson does not step onto the stage like a rock star seeking applause. He appears more like a signal drifting out of tune in a noisy era, carrying a voice so thin, high, and luminous that it unsettles the listener. Is this the sound of a human being, or of something else borrowing a human form in order to speak? While 1970s rock worshipped rebellion, scandal, and inflated ego, Anderson turned instead towards silence, meditation, and lyrics about light, the cosmos, and layers of consciousness. His talent carried Yes to the peak. That very difference, however, also pushed him to the margins. Behind the voice, once considered the soul of progressive rock, lies a life full of contradictions. A boy with severe asthma, who collapsed on the football field because he could not breathe. Says a school dropout who survived by taking on manual labor of all kinds. A musician unable to read music in the academic sense, yet capable of writing epic compositions stretching over tens of minutes, works that left an entire generation both mesmerized and bewildered. A co-founder of a band who was repeatedly branded a dangerous dreamer, then replaced while lying in a hospital bed. John Anderson's life is marked by musical partings, by a marriage whose collapse triggered a deep psychological breakdown, and by the feeling of being abandoned by the very musical family he helped create. And yet from those fractures, Anderson keeps rising, keeps singing, as if each time he lifts his voice, it is an act of self-rescue. So why is it that, after more than half a century, people still fall silent when John Anderson sings? That voice was not born under stage lights or inside polished recording studios. It was shaped much earlier, in a very different space, one without glamour, defined instead by confinement, scarcity, and the feeling of being trapped in a life far narrower than the imagination could accept. John Anderson was born on October 25, 1944, in Accrington, Lancashire, an industrial town in the north of England, where gray skies and repetitive routines seemed to leave little room for dreaming. He was born John Roy Anderson, the middle child in a large family, growing up in a small house perpetually crowded, sealed tight by the pressures of making a living. Anderson's childhood is not remembered for carefree moments. Asthma followed him from an early age, forcing his fragile body to learn how to live within its own limits. And there were days when breath itself felt like a luxury, when the sensation of air being taken away made him realize that he did not belong to the ordinary dreams of other children his age. Football, the great passion of his early years, ended abruptly when he collapsed on the pitch, unable to breathe. It left behind not only disappointment, but a quiet, lingering question. If he could not live within the rhythm of this world, was there another path at all? School offered little refuge. Anderson struggled to concentrate, failed to fit into rigid discipline, and was quickly labeled more of a dreamer than a model student. Music at that point was not an ambition. It was the only place where he could truly settle. On Sunday mornings, church bells rang through the cold, damp air of Lancashire, carrying a rhythm entirely different from everyday life. Within those sounds, Anderson began to sense a language beyond words, one that would later become the foundation of everything he wrote and sang. Leaving school at 15, Anderson stepped directly into working life through jobs that left no room for imagination, delivering milk, laboring on construction sites, then standing for hours in a tobacco factory. The monotony, the bleak weather, and the endless repetition did not harden him. Instead, they pushed him further inward. He listened to classical music, became absorbed in Celtic mythology, and gravitated toward ideas that stretched beyond ordinary logic. Without formal training, without learning music theory in the traditional sense, Anderson taught himself to recognize sound through intuition. He heard melodic strands forming in his mind and searched for any means available to follow them. It was during this period that a quiet habit took shape. Rather than interpreting the world through precise language, Anderson learned to experience it through color, breath, and movement. The feeling of not belonging ceased to be pure insecurity and slowly transformed into a driving force. A need to create another kind of space, one where music did not need to explain itself, only to exist. In retrospect, those childhood and teenage years did not prepare him to become a star. They prepared him to become a persistent wanderer, someone who would later guide an entire generation into regions of sound that had never before been named. The feeling of not belonging to the old world did not disappear when Anderson left his teenage years behind. It merely changed shape. Music ceased to be a private refuge and became a field of experimentation, a place where he tested whether the vague sounds in his head could stand upright in real life. In 1965, he joined the Warriors, a small beat band surviving on cover gigs at weddings, pubs, and cheap nightclubs. The group traveled to Germany hoping for a breakthrough, but cold nights, indifferent audiences, and fees barely enough to pay for a meal quickly dragged the dream back to earth. When they returned to England, the Warriors fell apart, leaving Anderson stranded in London without a contract, without money, carrying only the sense that he had gone farther than his hometown, yet still had not reached where he needed to be. The years that followed were a stretch of mere survival, held together by odd jobs ranging from restaurant work to manual labor, while his mind remained fixated on a question that refused to go away. Was it possible to make music that did not exist to flatter taste? The turning point came in 1968, in a small room lit dimly, where the volume of the music could not mask the boredom of familiar radio hits. There, Anderson met Chris Squire. Technically and temperamentally different, the two shared the same exhaustion with the safe formulas dominating the airwaves. Squire brought discipline and a clear sonic ambition. Anderson carried intuition, imagery, and ideas that spilled beyond the 3-minute song. Their bond was not built on planning, but on the shared sense that they were searching for the same exit. When the new band took shape, the name Yes emerged less as a strategy than as an instinctive response, a short open word, unrestrictive, spacious enough to hold possibility. The first albums were born from that mindset. Yes, 1969, and Time and a Word, 1970, revealed a psychedelic band with ambitions beyond convention, noticed by critics, but not yet sharp enough to ignite commercial success. Anderson began pushing lyrics away from familiar themes of love or social protest, replacing them with images of the cosmos, ancient spirits, frequencies, and layered meanings that resisted easy interpretation. That ambiguity invited mockery, dismissed by some as self-indulgent fantasy. Within the young group, Squire remained one of the few who believed that this very obscurity was the path forward. And amid uncertain recording sessions and pressure to sound more accessible, Anderson slowly learned to accept his place slightly out of alignment, not out of a desire to be different, but because he knew no other way to be. That misalignment, once a source of doubt, suddenly found its anchor when Steve Howe entered the rehearsal room in 1971. Without lengthy debate, a connection formed by instinct alone, Anderson offered images, colors, and abstract blocks of thought. Howe answered with sharp, disciplined guitar lines, turning the intangible into structures with weight. One spoke in metaphor, the other replied through strings. The exchange was so immediate that the rest of the band sensed a new creative axis taking shape, one where ideas were not asked what they were for, but how far they could go. The Yes album arrived as the result of that shift, a decisive transformation. Yours is no disgrace, opened a space broader and freer than anything Yes had attempted before. And while Starship Trooper demonstrated how Anderson and Howe could pull a song beyond conventional limits together. Anderson's soaring voice no longer drifted unanchored. It was tethered to guitar parts that balanced discipline with exploration. For the first time, his ambition was no longer treated as a burden. It became the engine. Released at the end of 1971, Fragile was the moment the public truly felt that engine engage. Roundabout was not only the hit that pushed Yes into the spotlight, it proved that complex music could still carry listeners along if it possessed enough internal gravity. Success arrived quickly, followed by relentless touring, during which Anderson and Howe seemed to read each other's thoughts on stage, communicating through glances and breath rather than signals. Close to the Edge pushed that bond to an extreme. Instead of assembling separate songs, they built a near-symphonic structure, with Anderson's voice acting as a guiding force and Howe's guitar flowing in constant transformation. The album was hailed as a pinnacle of progressive rock. Night after night, sold-out performances followed, and Yes entered a phase where each evening on stage felt less like a concert than a collective ritual. That sense of invincibility led directly to Tales from Topographic Oceans. Anderson believed he was reaching a deeper layer of musical thought, weaving Eastern philosophy and epic structure into each side of vinyl. Howe stayed close, but not everyone was prepared to travel that far. Rick Wakeman grew increasingly weary of the extended passages and the strain of performance. When the album was released, skepticism from the British press quickly cast a shadow over the tense 1974 tour. While Anderson continued to sing with near absolute conviction, cracks were already visible. Wakeman's departure marked the first time that the dream of limitless expansion demanded a tangible loss in return. Before the shock of Tales had time to settle, Yes was forced to change shape in order to survive. Patrick Moraz stepped in on keyboards, bringing with him a sharper rhythmic edge and a strong jazz-inflected sensibility. Relayer emerged from that state, less contemplative and shimmering than before, more abrasive, jagged, and at times confrontational. Anderson still sang as if guiding a spiritual journey, but beneath his voice the music twisted more violently, digging deeper and striking harder. The album proved that the band had not run out of ideas, yet it also exposed an uncomfortable truth. In order to stay alive, Yes now had to keep rebuilding itself from the inside. A brief pause followed when Rick Wakeman returned for Going for the One. His comeback restored a sense of balance that had been missing, and as though familiar pieces had slipped back into place. Anderson felt both relieved and cautious, fully aware of how fragile that harmony was. Tormato, which followed, failed to sustain the momentum. The music became fragmented, and disagreements that seemed to have receded resurfaced in the studio and on stage. When the band went to Paris in 1979 hoping to find a new direction, the differences could no longer be concealed. Anderson longed for music that uplifted the spirit, open, ascending, expansive, while Steve Howe and Chris Squire wanted to pull Yes towards something harder, sharper, more grounded. This clash went beyond aesthetics. It cut to the core of how each member understood the band's purpose. Anderson left. Wakeman followed. What remained was not just a personnel gap, but a rupture in identity. Steve Howe chose to keep Yes alive at any cost. Drama arrived with Trevor Horn and Jeff Downs, its sound modern and icy, sufficient to sustain touring, but unable to hide the sense that the band's soul had shifted elsewhere. When Yes disbanded in 1981, Anderson stood outside, watching a familiar name drift away from the coordinates that had once defined it. Ironically, a few years later, he would return under that same name. yet in a radically different form. 90,125 brought Yes to unprecedented commercial heights. Owner of a Lonely Heart, dominated global airwaves and topped the charts. The success confirmed the enduring pull of Anderson's voice, but it also left him with the uneasy feeling of having been carried far beyond the musical language he had once set out to explore. By the late 1980s, Anderson sought a return to first principles through the ABWH project with Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman, and Bill Byford. The music was complex, classically inclined, and ambitious, an echo of what many felt to be the original Yes spirit. But when the two branches of Yes were forced into a merger for union, the dream of reconciliation quickly turned into a maze. Fragmented recording sessions, decisions that stripped members of creative control, and a massive tour heavy on numbers but light on unity left a lasting scar. Anderson still sang, still stood at the center of the stage, yet behind the lights was a growing sense that his path within Yes was no longer aligned with those he had once considered companions. After years of fragmentation and incomplete reunions, Anderson's return alongside Steve Howe, Chris Squire, and Alan White in the mid-1990s felt like a collective exhale. Keys to Ascension did not attempt to prove anything new. Instead, it rekindled a feeling from a time when Yes believed music could bend time itself. Extended performances of classic material alongside new compositions created a space that felt familiar without becoming stale, a space where Anderson's voice once again found a natural place within complex structures that no longer felt forced. It was a rare moment in which he felt no need to fight for leadership, only to be present. The touring cycle of the late 1990s was long and endurance-driven, with near-marathon performances night after night. Anderson sang as if each piece were a ritual, and then audiences came not merely to hear the music, but to re-inhabit a time when Yes had opened other doors altogether. From the outside, this stability convinced many that old fractures had healed. Internally, the old questions never disappeared. Anderson remained drawn toward conceptual projects, ideas that sought to expand musical space beyond the limits of performance itself. Howe and the others, by contrast, grew increasingly focused on maintaining a direct bond with audiences, ensuring that each show remained anchored in familiar ground. The difference did not erupt into open conflict, but it quietly shaped smaller choices, set lists, program structures, the direction of future work. Anderson, guided by an instinct that always faced forward, began to sense invisible walls forming around his creative space. When Yes decided to pause in 2004 so that everyone could recharge and await a 40th anniversary reunion, the decision carried more weight than a simple break. For Anderson, it was a silence both necessary and unsettling. A moment in which he recognized that the current harmony might only be temporary, and that the paths ahead, though bound by shared memory, were already drifting apart in ways that would be difficult to reverse. Against the band's constant motion, John Anderson's private life unfolded in a very different register. Quiet, guarded, and always standing behind the music. Before Yes had a clear shape, before the name John Anderson was recognizable as a voice amid the crowd, there was already a deeply ordinary anchor in his life, Irene. They met when John was still a young man in the north of England, living through precarious days shaped by manual labor and dreams that had yet to find a name. Irene did not enter his life with glamour or artistic ambition. She arrived at a time when John was still searching for his footing, when music existed more inside his head than out in the world. Their bond grew out of a simple shared life, from years when John did not yet know how far his voice might carry him. They married in 1964, while John was still bound to the rhythms of working-class life. Their small family took shape during those difficult years, and their daughter Deborah was born not long after. Becoming a father so early placed John in a quiet, unresolved tension. On one side, the responsibility of family. On the other, an intensifying sense that he could not live fully without pursuing music to its furthest limits. When John began leaving Lancashire in search of opportunity in London, the distance was more than geographical. Sporadic gigs, unannounced trips, and returns marked by a mind still suspended in sound and unfinished ideas gradually threw their shared life out of sync. Irene carried the weight of stability while John drifted ever deeper into a world she could not follow at the same pace. There was no betrayal, or no spectacle, but prolonged absence and a mind perpetually elsewhere slowly hollowed out a space that could not be filled. By the end of the 1960s, as John stood on the threshold of a decisive phase of his life with Chris Squire and the early stirrings of Yes, that bond could no longer withstand another major displacement. They separated in 1969, quietly, without public aftershocks. No bitter accounts, no media disputes, only two people recognizing that they had moved on to different trajectories. That fracture created no scandal, but it left a long silence within John. Leaving his first family coincided with the moment his career was about to open its largest door, ensuring that loss and guilt would shadow each step forward that followed. From that point on, John almost never turned his private life into a story to be told. What happened with Irene and Deborah was held back as memory that required no explanation. Existing alongside the music, quietly, persistently, never offered up as material for display. After leaving Irene, John Anderson did not step immediately into a new, settled life. The late 1960s found him living between two worlds, days spent juggling work and music, still without clear form, nights carrying the muted loss of a family that had dissolved. It was during this period that Jennifer Baker appeared, without noise, and without ties to stages or spotlights, entering John's life before he himself knew whether he had the strength to see his emerging dream through. They married in 1969, the same year Yes began to find its own voice. Their life together started in small houses, with schedules fractured by rehearsals and trial performances, money uncertain. Jennifer lived with a man who carried music in his head even after leaving the rehearsal room. As Yes moved from London basements toward larger stages, their family grew. 2 children were born during years when John was learning to be both a father and a musician, swept into an increasingly relentless creative rhythm. During Yes's ascent with Fragile, Close to the Edge, and extended tours, John was rarely fully present at home. He returned between tour legs, but his mind remained in the studio, with unfinished sonic structures, with ideas he could not set aside in order to inhabit an ordinary, domestic life. Jennifer became the one who kept the family from drifting off course, raising the children, managing daily life, accepting a husband whose presence was more physical than attentive. As Yes entered cycles of departure and return, fragmentation and reunion throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the strain within their marriage did not erupt into public conflict, but accumulated year after year. John lived according to the pulse of music and an increasingly sealed inner world, as while Jennifer faced the reality of sharing life with someone who never truly stood still. The misalignment did not arise from betrayal or drama, but from the gradual realization that they were no longer standing on the same ground. By the early 1990s, after more than 2 decades together, they separated quietly. No disputes, no media narratives, no explanations offered. For John, the collapse did not produce an immediate breakdown. but it pulled him out of the current he had long inhabited. For a considerable period afterward, he largely withdrew from recording and touring, slowed his pace, turned toward meditation, and distanced himself from both the stage and social life. What unfolded with Jennifer and their children never became a story John chose to tell. It remains a low, underlying layer beneath the music, shaping his fierce protection of privacy and reinforcing the sense that every artistic advance carries with it a portion of life that cannot be held on to. The long silence that followed his separation from Jennifer was not a period in which John Anderson went searching for a new anchor. It was a stretch of time in which he nearly detached himself from all familiar rhythms. The early 1990s passed quietly. Few appearances, few releases, a life angled toward meditation, yoga, drawing, and writing, as a way of recalibrating his own breath. Music was no longer a place for display. It became a private space where John could exist without explanation. A Jane Lutenberger entered John Anderson's life after this extended phase of withdrawal and inner reconstruction. By the late 1990s, John was no longer running or acting on impulse. He had slowed his pace, devoted time to meditation, drawing, writing, and long intervals of silence between travels. Jane appeared within that context, not as a disruption, but as a measured presence, patient enough not to disturb the fragile rhythm John was trying to preserve. Jane is a singer with her own creative life, and she understands music not merely as performance, but as a way of being. Their closeness developed gradually, through shared work and through days that required very few words. In Jane, John found a form of companionship unlike those he had known before. No pressure, no steering, no demand to occupy the center. Their relationship grew quietly, grounded more in mutual respect for personal space than in schedules or labels. In 1997, when John Anderson was already in his 50s and no longer under pressure to prove anything to the world, they formally became partners. The timing was significant. This was not compensation for earlier chaos, but the choice of someone who had come to understand what he needed in order to keep living and creating. Their shared life unfolded discreetly, and away from media curiosity. Jane did not stand behind the stage in a traditional sense, nor did she attempt to shape John's creative direction. She was present as a true companion, working alongside him when needed, touring when appropriate, and stepping back when John required solitude to inhabit his inner world. Life with Jane was not always smooth. John still carried old wounds, creative cycles that surged and receded, memories of being pushed to the margins within the very band he had helped bring into existence. Jane did not try to fix him or force him out of those darker regions. She chose to remain in the same space, close enough not to abandon him, distant enough that he never felt controlled. When tension arose, it did not erupt into loud conflict. It settled into extended silences, the kind of silence both had already learned to live with long before they met. That shared sensibility allowed their life together to endure in ways few people noticed. No display, no neatly packaged narrative for the public, no family image presented as part of a brand. Jane became the person beside John as he learned to accept aging, a changing voice, and an increasingly uncertain position within Yes. If earlier relationships had been stretched thin by ambition and constant motion, life with Jane unfolded like a long breath, one that allowed John Anderson to keep creating without sacrificing yet another part of his private life. From the quiet pause that followed the closing of ARW, John Anderson did not turn back to search for another reunion door. The project's end, without delivering the studio album many had expected, did not provoke public anger, but it was enough for him to recognize that he had reached the outer limit of collective compromise. With no one left to convince, John chose a simpler path, to sing yes in his own way, without permission, without inheritance battles, without the need to hang a historical signboard. That decision led him into a space that seemed paradoxical. In 2023, John stood on stage with Band Geeks, a group of musicians decades younger, performing yes classics that audiences thought they already knew by heart. The difference was not in the set list, but in the energy being transmitted. John was not reenacting youth nor replaying memory. He sang as someone telling an old story in the voice of the present, allowing difficult passages, extended forms, and supposedly unfriendly structures to breathe at a different tempo. The generational gap did not create tension. It sharpened John's sense of his place as a guide, not an occupier of space. That alignment carried forward into 2024 with the album True, a recording without competitive ambition or anything to prove. The music makes no attempt to recreate past peaks, nor does it chase new trends. It places John's voice in its most present state, accepting the natural changes brought by time and allowing the spiritual core, the element that once defined yes, to lead technique rather than follow it. True does not require awards to exist. It exists as a quiet affirmation that continuing to create at this age is not an act of nostalgia, but a way of living. By 2025, the tour Yes Epics, Classics, and More carried John across North America. Long, demanding pieces, requiring endurance and sustained focus, remained in the program as a deliberate challenge. On stage, he did not evade the truth of age. He worked with it. The way John stands, the way he pauses before singing, the way he allows the younger band to hold the rhythmic spine of complex sections reveals an artist who no longer needs to prove himself as the center, yet still controls the current. At 80, the mindset no longer revolves around being remembered. John appears instead as someone recording signals day by day, slowly, steadily, without rushing toward conclusions. Each performance feels like a tuning session. Some nights clear, some nights noisy, none abandoned. As most reunion narratives have hardened into disputes over memory, John Anderson stands there not to close the past, but to demonstrate that the present remains wide enough for a voice that refuses to stand still. John Anderson's legacy does not sit neatly in record sales or award tallies, measures he never set out to chase, but endures in the way he redefined the role of the voice in rock. Before John, singers were typically storytellers or vehicles for ego. With Yes, the voice became an atmosphere surrounding the music, high, luminous, genderless, not imposing meaning but opening space for listeners to enter on their own terms. From Roundabout to Close to the Edge, from Awaken to projects beyond Yes, John turned lyrics into breath, transforming long, complex structures into a continuous emotional experience. That influence has carried forward into generations of progressive and art rock singers, artists who learned from him how to sing as a guide, not a ruler. At the level of composition, John leaves behind a rare philosophy: music as ritual, not product. He accepted aesthetic risk, accepted misunderstanding, accepted the loss of central position to protect a long view. The prolonged conflicts within Yes, departures, returns, splintering, do not blur that legacy. They reveal the cost of holding a spiritual core intact inside an industrial machine. As rock tilted toward the market, John remained with extended forms, metaphysical impulses, and the belief that sound can open inner doors. Entering his 80s, he does not step on stage to be remembered, but to register new signals day by day, with Band Geeks, with familiar songs breathed anew, with new work that has nothing to prove. Here, legacy is not a fixed monument, but a current still moving. John Anderson leaves no closed conclusion to his journey. He leaves a way of living with music, listening before singing, trusting intuition before formula. And if you have ever stood still as close to the edge unfolded, if you felt yourself being led rather than explained to, then you have already touched that legacy. Which moment do you remember most when listening to John Anderson? Share your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so we can continue these unfinished musical journeys together.